There's a theatre on 125th Street in Harlem where careers were born in minutes and destroyed just as fast. Where a 17-year-old girl who planned to dance changed her mind at the last second and became the first lady of song. Where a crowd could turn on you so viciously they'd drag you off stage with a broom. Where James Brown recorded what Rolling Stone calls the greatest live album ever made, paying for it himself because his label thought nobody would buy it. This is the Apollo Theatre, and if you think you know this story, you probably don't know the half of it. The beginning. The building at 253 West 125th Street opened in 1914 as Hurtig and Siemens' New Burlesque Theatre. Let that sink in for a moment. The most famous venue in black entertainment history started as a whites-only burlesque house. Jules Hurtig and Harry Seaman leased the building from owner Sidney Cohen, and they had very specific ideas about their audience. White men, raucous comedy, suggestive performances, the kind of entertainment that polite society publicly condemned while privately enjoying. For 20 years, that's exactly what it was. Black performers couldn't work there. Black audiences couldn't attend. The theatre sat in the heart of Harlem, a neighbourhood undergoing massive demographic transformation during the Great Migration, and it might as well have been in a different country. The building itself was designed by George Keister, an architect whose work included the Belasco Theatre and what's now the American Airlines Theatre. He created a neoclassical structure with approximately 1,500 seats across 3 levels. It was beautiful in its own way, elegant even, but its beauty was reserved for a very specific clientele. Harlem in the 1910s and 1920s was changing fast. Developers had built extensively in anticipation of the 1904 opening of an elevated subway line connecting uptown with downtown Manhattan. They expected wealthy white New Yorkers to move north to fill those new buildings. It didn't happen. The real estate bubble burst spectacularly. Rather than lose their investments entirely, property owners started renting to African Americans who'd been living in other Manhattan neighborhoods like the Upper West Side, Lincoln Square, and Hell's Kitchen. More importantly, Black Americans were arriving from the South in massive numbers during the Great Migration, fleeing Jim Crow oppression, seeking economic opportunity, building new lives in northern cities. By the late 1920s, Harlem had transformed into the largest urban black community in the nation. The Harlem Renaissance was in full swing. Jazz was revolutionizing American music. Writers, artists, musicians, intellectuals were creating a cultural explosion that would reshape American culture for generations. And 125th Street, right where the theatre sat, had become the commercial heart of this transformation. Shops, restaurants, entertainment venues, all catering to Harlem's predominantly black population. Yet Hurtig and Siemens' New Burlesque Theatre remained steadfastly, defiantly whites only. That changed in 1934, not because anyone had a sudden attack of conscience, but because the economics made it impossible to continue. The anti-obscenity movement was making life difficult for burlesque theatres everywhere. New York Mayor Fiorello LaGuardia launched a campaign against burlesque that shut down venues across the city. Hurtig and Siemens was among the casualties. Sidney Cohen, who still owned the building, needed new operators. He found them in Morris Sussman and Sidney S. Cohen, no relation. They took over in 1933, and they had a radically different vision, or maybe just a practical one. The neighborhood had changed. The audience had changed. Fighting demographics was stupid business. In 1934, they brought in Frank Schiffman and Leo Brecker. These two already owned most of the theatres in Harlem, including the Lafayette Theatre, where they'd pioneered hiring black performers and admitting black audiences. They knew exactly what they were doing and what kind of money could be made by serving the community that actually lived in Harlem rather than pretending it didn't exist. On January 26, 1934, the newly christened 125th Street Apollo Theatre opened its doors to black performers and audiences for the first time. The show that night was Jazz à la carte, headlined by Benny Carter and his orchestra, with Ralph Cooper and Ada Ward. The New York Amsterdam News called it one of the most important theatre events in the history of Harlem. They weren't wrong. Something had fundamentally shifted. A barrier had fallen. The Apollo would become the theatre where black performers could showcase their talents without the degradation and restrictions they faced in white-owned venues downtown. Where they could work not just on stage, but backstage in technical positions, production roles, management. Where they could fail or succeed in front of audiences who looked like them, who understood what they were trying to do, who judged them on merit rather than racial prejudice. Frank Schiffman became the face of the operation. Brecker worked behind the scenes. Together, they built pathways for performers to succeed beyond New York City, developing relationships with theatres across the country that formed what became known as the Chitlin Circuit. A network of venues where black performers could tour, build audiences, develop their craft, make actual livings from their talent. But the Apollo's most revolutionary innovation came from Ralph Cooper, who'd headlined that opening night show. He had an idea for a weekly event that would give unknown performers a chance to prove themselves in front of a real audience. He called it Amateur Night. It would become the most famous talent competition in American entertainment history, and the most brutal, Amateur Night. Amateur Night at the Apollo began as a Wednesday night tradition. The concept was simple enough. Unknown performers got a few minutes on stage to win over the crowd. Winners got prize money and potentially life-changing opportunities. Losers got booed, jeered, and humiliated in ways that would probably violate modern standards of human decency. The Apollo audience didn't believe in being polite. They paid their money, and they expected to be entertained. If you couldn't deliver, they let you know immediately and loudly. Booing was just the start. They'd shout insults, throw things, create such hostile noise that continuing became impossible. And if the crowd turned against you badly enough, the executioner appeared. This was an actual role, someone who physically removed rejected performers from the stage. Howard "Sandman" Sims created this position, literally sweeping unpopular acts off the stage with a broom like they were trash that needed clearing. Sims had won Amateur Night himself 25 times, so he understood both triumph and failure intimately. He knew what that stage could do to people. When Sims left in 1989 to pursue other opportunities, C.P. Lacey took over. What was supposed to be a 2-week temp job became a 30-year career. Lacey had won Amateur Night 7 times himself with his James Brown impersonation. The crowd loved him so much they never once booed him off stage. But he'd drag plenty of others off, continuing the tradition Sims established. The psychology was fascinating and cruel. Amateur Night forced performers to face immediate, unfiltered judgment. No second chances, no gentle critiques, no participation trophies. You walked out there knowing the crowd could destroy your confidence in seconds, and if you couldn't handle that pressure, you didn't belong on that stage. Period. Some performers crumbled under it. Luther Vandross got booed off 4 separate times before finally winning. 4 times. Most people would have quit after one humiliation, but Vandross kept coming back, kept improving, kept trying until he conquered that crowd and launched himself toward becoming one of the greatest R&B vocalists in history. James Brown faced the Apollo crowd in 1952 and failed spectacularly. The future godfather of soul got booed off stage during his first Amateur Night attempt. He came back later, won, and developed such a deep connection to the venue that he'd record 4 live albums there over his career. When he died in 2006, his body lay in state on the Apollo stage before his funeral. allowing fans to pay respects at the place most closely connected to his legend. 13-year-old Lauryn Hill walked onto that stage full of hope and got destroyed. She sang Smokey Robinson's Who's Lovin' You, a song far too complex and mature for a teenager to deliver convincingly. The crowd booed mercilessly, but Hill finished her song anyway, showing the determination that would later produce The Miseducation of Lauryn Hill. Years later, she returned with the Fugees as an established star. That early amateur night experience had taught her something crucial about resilience. But some performers conquered amateur night on their first try. Sarah Vaughan went from Newark teenager to emerging jazz legend through one winning performance in the 1930s. Her sophisticated singing stood out immediately. Music insiders in the audience recognized her talent, leading to opportunities with band leaders Earl Hines and Billy Eckstine that launched her career. And then there was Ella Fitzgerald, Ella. November 21st, 1934. Less than a year after the Apollo opened to black performers, 17-year-old Ella Fitzgerald stood backstage at amateur night. Her name had been drawn in the weekly lottery that gave unknowns a shot at performing. She planned to dance. Dancing was her passion, what she'd come there to do. Then she saw the Edwards sisters perform. They were local dancers, professionals, and they were spectacular. Ella watched them and knew immediately she couldn't compete. Not as a dancer, not tonight. Panic set in. She was about to walk out on that stage in front of hundreds of people, and she'd already lost before she started. So she changed her mind. She'd sing instead. Ella walked onto the Apollo stage wearing shabby clothes, looking gangly and unkempt, a diamond in the roughest possible form. The crowd saw this awkward teenager and started laughing. What was she going to do out there? She looked terrified. She was terrified. Ralph Cooper, the same man who'd created Amateur Night and headlined the Apollo's opening show, was emceeing that night. He saw Ella freezing, saw the crowd starting to turn, and he rushed on stage to help her. "Gather yourself," he told her. "Take a breath. Try again." Ella had chosen to sing The Object of My Affection, a song popularised by Connie Boswell of the Boswell Sisters. By her own later admission, she was blatantly imitating Boswell's style. The first few notes were a disaster. She was rushing, nervous, completely out of her element. But then something shifted. She found her voice, found the rhythm, found whatever that thing is that separates someone who can sing from someone who can make a room stop breathing and listen. The crowd heard it. The laughter stopped. The jeering stopped. Attention focused on this awkward teenage girl who suddenly didn't seem awkward at all when she opened her mouth and let that voice out. Ella won Amateur Night, won the $25 prize, which in 1934 was real money. More importantly, she was supposed to win a week of performances at the Apollo as part of her prize. The theatre never gave her that week, probably because of how she looked, how unkempt and rough she appeared. But word spread anyway. In January 1935, just months after her Apollo win, Fitzgerald performed at the Harlem Opera House with Tiny Bradshaw's band. Later that year, drummer and bandleader Chick Webb heard about this kid with the incredible voice. He was reluctant at first. She was gawky, unkempt, not what you'd expect from a star performer. But he gave her a shot, and by 1935, Ella Fitzgerald was singing with the Chick Webb Orchestra at the Savoy Ballroom. She recorded several hits with Webb's band, but A Tisket, A Tasket in 1938 made her a household name. She co-wrote the song, a clever reworking of a nursery rhyme, and it became one of the biggest-selling records of the decade. When Webb died in 1939, Fitzgerald took over leadership of the band, becoming Ella Fitzgerald and her famous orchestra. That Apollo stage, that brutal amateur night crowd, that split-second decision to sing instead of dance, it all changed American music. Ella Fitzgerald became the First Lady of Song, won 13 Grammy Awards, received the National Medal of Arts and the Presidential Medal of Freedom. She recorded over 200 albums and 2,000 songs in her lifetime, selling over 40 million albums. All because she walked onto the Apollo stage on November 21st, 1934, scared out of her mind, and found her voice when it mattered most. The golden years. Through the late 1930s and into the 1940s, the Apollo became the crown jewel of the Chitlin Circuit, that network of venues across America where black performers could work when mainstream venues remained closed to them. The Chitlin Circuit included the Regal Theatre in Chicago, the Howard Theatre in Washington, D.C., the Royal Theatre in Baltimore, and dozens of smaller venues throughout the South and Midwest. But the Apollo sat at the apex. Playing the Apollo meant you'd arrived. Getting booked there repeatedly meant you were somebody. Every major black performer played there, and many not so major performers who dreamed of becoming major. Dewey Pigmeat Markham became a resident comedian, perfecting a stage persona that influenced generations of performers who came after. His catchphrase, "Here comes the judge," would become part of American popular culture decades before. Laughing made it famous to white audiences. Jackie Moms Mabley was another resident comedian, and she was revolutionary in ways people don't fully appreciate. A black woman doing stand-up comedy in the 1930s and 40s, working blue material, talking about sex and relationships, and race with a frankness that would shock modern audiences who think edgy comedy is a recent invention. Mabley developed a stage character, an older woman in a house dress, that allowed her to say things other performers couldn't get away with. The Apollo audiences loved her, and she recorded multiple live albums there over her career. Tap dancers like the Nicholas brothers turned dance into athletic artistry that seemed to defy physics. Fayard and Harold Nicholas performed leaps, splits, and synchronized movements that left audiences gasping. Watch film footage of them, and you'll see why they're considered among the greatest dancers in American history. The Apollo stage gave them space to innovate, to push boundaries, to create choreography that influenced everyone from Michael Jackson to Gregory Hines. Bill Bojangles Robinson was already legendary when he played the Apollo, but the theatre gave him a Harlem home base. Robinson had worked in vaudeville for decades, performed in Hollywood films, achieved crossover success that few black performers of his era managed. But the Apollo audiences saw him as theirs, claimed him in ways white audiences never could. He was theirs first, theirs fundamentally, and his Apollo performances reflected that connection. Buck and Bubbles, the tap-dancing duo of Buck Washington and John Bubbles Sublett, brought a different style to the Apollo stage. Bubbles is credited with inventing rhythm tap, a style that emphasized the percussive elements of tap dancing, making the dancer not just a visual performer, but a musician creating sound with their feet. The Nicholas brothers perfected acrobatic flash. Bubbles perfected rhythmic complexity. Both styles flourished at the Apollo because the audiences understood exactly what they were watching. In 1935, Bessie Smith performed at the Apollo for 4 weeks. These were her only live performances that year, and they would be among her last. The Empress of the Blues was nearing the end of her career, her commercial peak long past, struggling with personal demons and an industry that had moved on to younger performers. But the Apollo gave her a stage that respected who she was and what she'd contributed to American music. The audiences who came to see her weren't looking for the next big thing. They were honouring a legend, paying respects to someone who'd shaped the blues and influenced every singer who came after. By 1937, according to Frank Schiffman, the Apollo was the largest employer of black theatrical workers in the United States, and the only theatre in New York City hiring black people in backstage positions. That mattered enormously. It wasn't just about who could perform. It was about who could work the lights, who could manage sound, who could handle production, who could learn technical skills, who could build careers in entertainment beyond just being on stage. Black stage hands, electricians, sound engineers, stage managers, all learning their crafts at the Apollo, all building expertise that could lead to work elsewhere. The theatre was developing infrastructure, creating a pipeline of skilled black workers in an industry that had traditionally excluded them from everything except performance roles. That infrastructure would prove crucial as the entertainment industry gradually desegregated over subsequent decades. Billie Holiday, Lena Horne, and the Count Basie Orchestra all made their Apollo debuts in the late 1930s. These weren't just shows. These were cultural events, moments when artists who would define American music for generations first connected with audiences who understood exactly what they were hearing. Billie Holiday's voice carried pain and beauty in equal measure. Her phrasing, her ability to bend notes and manipulate timing, her gift for finding emotional truth in lyrics, all of it made her one of the greatest jazz vocalists in history. The Apollo audiences recognized that genius immediately. They didn't need critics to tell them they were witnessing something special. They knew. Lena Horne brought glamour and sophistication to the Apollo stage. She'd go on to Hollywood success, becoming one of the first black performers to sign a long-term contract with a major studio. But she never forgot the Apollo, never forgot the audiences who supported her when Hollywood still saw black performers as stereotypes and caricatures. Her Apollo performances connected her to a community that claimed her as theirs, regardless of her mainstream success. The Count Basie Orchestra represented swing at its finest. Basie's piano playing was economical, leaving space for his band members to shine. His arrangements were sophisticated without being pretentious. The orchestra could swing hard or swing soft, could build to crescendos or maintain subtle grooves, could satisfy dancers and serious listeners simultaneously. The Apollo's acoustics and the audience's musical knowledge made it an ideal venue for Basie's orchestra to showcase their range. The Apollo maintained a tradition that seems bizarre today, but worked brilliantly then. They alternated live stage shows with B-movies, allegedly to clear the house between performances. You'd watch Count Basie tear through a set, then sit through some forgettable second-run film, then watch another live performance. It was practical, maybe cynical, but it meant more shows, more audiences, more opportunities for performers to hone their craft in front of real crowds, night after night after night. World War II didn't slow the Apollo down. If anything, it accelerated the theatre's importance as Harlem became a centre of black culture, politics, and identity during a period when black Americans were fighting fascism abroad while facing discrimination at home. The contradiction wasn't lost on anyone. Black soldiers fought for freedom in Europe while their families couldn't eat at white-owned restaurants in Mississippi. The Apollo became one of the places where that anger, that frustration, that determination to demand better could be expressed through art. The 1940s saw the Apollo staging its first musical comedy, Tan Manhattan, in 1941. The cast was entirely black, the creative team was black, and the show ran successfully for weeks. That matters. It showed that black productions could draw audiences and make money doing sophisticated theatrical work beyond just music and comedy. They hosted plays. Anna Lucasta, in 1949, a drama about family dysfunction and moral compromise that had originally been written about a Polish family, but was recast with black actors. The Respectful Prostitute in 1950, a controversial play by Jean-Paul Sartre dealing with racism and false accusations in the American South. The Detective Story in 1951, a police procedural that showed black actors in roles beyond the stereotypes Hollywood perpetuated. The programming expanded beyond music and comedy into broader theatrical entertainment, though music remained the Apollo's heart and soul. That heart kept beating through the 1950s as American music underwent yet another revolution. The 1950s brought rock and roll, which white teenagers discovered and white performers commercialized, even though black musicians had been playing variations of it for years. The Apollo booked the R&B performers who'd influenced Elvis Presley, Chuck Berry, Little Richard, who were creating the raw material that white artists sanitized and sold to mainstream audiences. The irony was thick. Black performers at the Apollo perfecting music that white performers would steal credit for inventing. The Apollo adapted to the culture, booking performers who reflected what audiences wanted to hear. DJ-led shows became popular in the 1960s as radio DJs gained celebrity status, and their taste-making power influenced what records got played and what careers flourished. These DJ shows at the Apollo connected the theatre to the evolution of how black music was produced, presented, promoted, and consumed. Mambo invaded the Apollo in the 1950s as Latin influences transformed urban music. Machito and his Afro-Cubans, Tito Puente, these Latin jazz pioneers brought complex rhythms and horn arrangements that married Cuban traditions to American jazz and R&B. The Apollo audiences, many of whom were Puerto Rican and other Latino New Yorkers, embraced this fusion enthusiastically. The theatre served the whole Harlem community, not just African Americans. The Jewel Box Revue, a show featuring female impersonators, first appeared at the Apollo in 1959 and returned regularly through the 1970s. In an era when homosexuality remained deeply stigmatized and often criminalized, the Apollo booked entertainment that mainstream venues wouldn't touch. The revue was wildly popular, drawing audiences who appreciated the artistry, the glamour, the technical skill of the performers, regardless of, or perhaps because of, its subversive qualities. The Apollo wasn't prudish about what it presented. If audiences wanted to see it and it drew crowds, the Apollo booked it. That pragmatism served the theatre well, allowing it to evolve with changing tastes rather than insisting on narrow definitions of acceptable entertainment. In 1962, the Motortown Revue hit the Apollo stage, featuring Smokey Robinson and the Miracles, the Supremes, the Temptations, Mary Wells, Marvin Gaye, and a 12-year-old Stevie Wonder. Motown was revolutionizing black popular music, taking R&B and soul mainstream in ways previous generations of black artists had never achieved. Berry Gordy's label was creating a sound, a style, a level of production polish that made Motown records acceptable to white radio stations and white record buyers. The Apollo gave these emerging Motown stars a crucial platform during their rise. When Smokey Robinson arrived at the Apollo for the first time in 1959, he looked at the mural on the wall showing Ella Fitzgerald, Sarah Vaughan, Harry Belafonte, Jackie Wilson, and other legends. He turned to the Miracles and said he wanted to be on that mural someday. Years later, he would be. Playing the Apollo meant something to these young Detroit musicians trying to make it in the music industry. It connected them to history, to lineage, to a tradition of excellence they aspired to join. But one performance in 1962 would become the Apollo's most legendary moment, the recording that cemented the theatre's place in music history forever. Live at the Apollo, October 24th, 1962. James Brown and the Famous Flames took the Apollo stage for what would become the most famous live album in R&B history. Brown had been touring relentlessly, performing night after night across the Chitlin circuit, building a reputation as the most electrifying live performer in black music. He knew something that his record label didn't. His records couldn't capture what happened when he performed live. The energy, the showmanship, the athletic stamina, the split-second timing, the way he commanded a stage and manipulated an audience's emotions through sheer force of performance. Brown's live show was marvels of choreography and spontaneity combined. gospel impassioned fury married to complex polyrhythms that made people move in ways they didn't know they could move. King Records owner Sid Nathan refused to fund the recording. He thought it was commercial folly. Nobody bought live albums, he argued. People wanted new songs, studio recordings, not performances they could see in person. Funding a live album seemed like throwing money away. Brown paid for it himself. He believed so completely in what he was creating that he put up his own money to record the performance. The famous Flames, Bobby Byrd, Bobby Bennett and Lloyd Stallworth, played crucial roles in the show, but weren't even credited on the original album cover. That oversight wouldn't be corrected until decades later when CD releases finally acknowledged their contributions. The resulting album is barely half an hour long. By modern standards, it's short. But those 30 minutes captured something that had never been recorded before: the full force of James Brown live, working an audience that knew exactly what they were hearing and responded with the kind of enthusiasm that can't be faked or manufactured. Listen to Lost Someone on that album. It runs over 10 minutes. 10 minutes of Brown stretching a song, milking emotion, building and releasing tension, while women in the audience scream with perfectly timed articulation that became as much a part of the recording as Brown's vocals. Those weren't studio plants. That was real audience response to a performer at the absolute peak of his powers. The album spent 66 weeks on the Billboard Top Pop Albums chart, peaking at number 2. Record stores, especially in the Southeast, couldn't keep it in stock. They'd order cases at a time and sell out immediately. Nathan had been completely, spectacularly wrong. The live album became one of Brown's biggest commercial successes and introduced white America to what black audiences had known for years. James Brown Live was an experience that transcended what any studio recording could capture. Rolling Stone later called it the greatest live album of all time. In 2003, it ranked number 24 on their list of the 500 greatest albums ever. In 2004, the Library of Congress added it to the National Recording Registry. The album's influence extended far beyond R&B. Wayne Kramer of the MC5 cited it as direct inspiration for Kick Out the Jams, describing how they'd listened to Live at the Apollo on acid in the van on the way to gigs to get pumped up for performing. Brown would record more live albums at the Apollo throughout his career. Live at the Apollo Volume 2 in 1968. Revolution of the Mind, Live at the Apollo Volume 3 in 1971. Live at the Apollo 1995. Each captured moments of Brown's evolution as a performer, but none matched the raw electricity of that first recording in 1962. The Apollo wasn't just a venue for Brown, it was his laboratory, the place where he developed his music, tested new material, refined his stage show to mathematical precision. He demanded perfection from his band members, and the Apollo audience demanded perfection from him. That mutual pressure created greatness. When Brown died on Christmas Day 2006, they brought his body to the Apollo. He lay in state on that stage where he'd recorded his greatest live performances, where he'd connected with audiences in ways that defined his entire career. Tens of thousands of people gathered to pay respects. The line stretched for blocks. People waited hours just to file past the casket of the godfather of soul, knowing that the Apollo was the only appropriate place for that goodbye. The decline. By the mid-1970s, the Apollo was struggling. The theatre that had once seemed invincible faced the same decay and devastation affecting all of Harlem. The neighbourhood was collapsing economically. Crime was rising. Middle-class flight was draining resources. Buildings were abandoned. Infrastructure was crumbling. But the Apollo's decline also reflected a painful irony. The civil rights movement had broken down barriers that once confined black performers to the Chitlin circuit. They could play downtown venues now, they could appear on mainstream television. They could record for major labels and reach white audiences without mediation. Success meant black performers didn't need the Apollo the way they once had. Better opportunities existed elsewhere. Bigger paydays, larger audiences, mainstream acceptance that previous generations had been denied. The Apollo's owner, Bobby Schiffman, faced rising costs, declining ticket sales, and competition from venues that could offer performers more money and prestige. In January 1976, Schiffman reluctantly closed the Apollo. The theatre that had launched countless careers, that had shaped American music for over 4 decades, shut its doors. It briefly reopened in 1978. Bob Marley played there, one of the few white artists to perform at the Apollo, though Marley obviously wasn't white in any meaningful sense beyond technical Caribbean demographics. But the reopening didn't last. By November 1979, the Apollo closed again, this time looking more permanent. The building sat dark and unused. Harlem's commercial heart had moved elsewhere. 125th Street looked rough, dangerous, forgotten. The Apollo became another abandoned building in a neighborhood full of them, a monument to glory days that seemed impossible to reclaim. But some people refused to let it die completely. Resurrection. In 1981, Percy Sutton led a group of private investors in purchasing the Apollo. Sutton was a prominent lawyer who'd represented Malcolm X, a politician who'd served in the New York State Assembly, a media executive who'd founded Inner City Broadcasting Corporation. He understood the Apollo's importance beyond just entertainment value. This was cultural heritage worth preserving, history worth protecting, a symbol of black achievement and resilience that couldn't be allowed to disappear. The purchase price wasn't disclosed, but everyone involved knew they weren't buying a profitable business. They were buying responsibility, obligation, the chance to save something irreplaceable. The building received landmark status in 1983 from New York City, New York State, and the federal government. That triple designation was rare and significant. It meant the Apollo was recognized as architecturally and culturally important at every level of government. The landmark status came with preservation requirements and some funding opportunities, but it also meant the Apollo couldn't be torn down or substantially altered without permission. Whatever happened next had to respect the theatre's history, maintain its character, preserve its essence. The renovation took years and cost millions. The building had deteriorated badly during its closure. The roof leaked. Systems needed replacing. Infrastructure needed updating. Seats were damaged. Paint was peeling. Decades of deferred maintenance meant everything needed attention simultaneously. But they couldn't just gut the place and rebuild. This wasn't new construction. This was restoration. They had to maintain the character, the feel, the details that made the Apollo special. The neoclassical architecture, the 3-level seating arrangement, the acoustics that had made the theatre famous for live performance, the stage where legends had performed. Every decision required balancing preservation with modernization, respecting history while creating a venue that could function in the modern entertainment industry. On May 5th, 1985, the Apollo celebrated its 50th anniversary with a grand reopening and television special called Motown Returns to the Apollo. The lineup read like a who's who of American popular music. Stevie Wonder, Smokey Robinson, Little Richard, Diana Ross, Wilson Pickett, all performers who'd cut their teeth at the Apollo, who'd developed their careers on that stage, who'd never forgotten what the theatre meant to them. Rod Stewart showed up. George Michael performed. Al Green sang. These weren't Apollo regulars. These were mainstream pop stars paying respect to a venue that had influenced music they loved, even if they'd never performed there themselves. The show drew massive television audiences and announced loudly that the Apollo was back. relevant again, ready to reclaim its place in American entertainment. Christmas Eve, 1985, Amateur Night returned. The brutal, unforgiving tradition that had discovered Ella Fitzgerald, that had tormented Luther Vandross 4 times before he won, that had separated contenders from pretenders for over half a century, came back. Different hosts, different era, but the same fundamental equation. Walk out on that stage, face that crowd, win them over, or get booed off. The tradition that had made the Apollo famous was alive again. In 1991, the state of New York acquired the site and handed a 99-year lease to a non-profit foundation organised to operate the theatre. The lease cost $1 per year. Think about that. $1 annually for 99 years. The state essentially gave the Apollo to a non-profit dedicated to preserving its legacy and serving the community. That deal only makes sense if you understand that some things matter beyond market value, that cultural institutions serve purposes that financial statements can't capture. The Apollo Theatre Foundation, ATF, took over operations in 1992, officially transforming the venue from a commercial enterprise into a cultural institution focused on education, community outreach, and supporting emerging artists alongside booking established stars. This wasn't just a theatre anymore. This was a mission-driven organisation with responsibilities that extended far beyond selling tickets and making payroll. Renovations continued in phases over the following decades. These weren't just cosmetic updates. These were comprehensive rebuilding projects that cost tens of millions of dollars cumulatively. In 2005, the first major phase completed, installing over 1,500 new seats designed to match the original seating aesthetic, while meeting modern comfort and safety standards. They restored the 125th Street facade to its historic appearance, removing later alterations and bringing back the neoclassical details that had been obscured. They added a state-of-the-art marquee that combined modern LED technology with design elements that respected the building's character. They rebuilt the stage with modern rigging and technical capabilities while maintaining its dimensions and feel. They renovated the green room where performers prepared before facing that famous crowd. The building looked magnificent again, combining preservation of historic elements with modern technical capabilities that allowed the Apollo to host contemporary productions with complex lighting, sound, and staging requirements. You could bring a modern touring show to the Apollo and have the technical infrastructure to support it, but you'd still be performing in a space that felt connected to 1934, to history, to all the legends who'd stood on that same stage. The Apollo hosted major events that reflected its continued cultural importance. James Brown's memorial in 2006 drew international attention. Michael Jackson's memorial in 2009 brought fans from around the world to 125th Street. Barack Obama campaigned there in 2007 before his presidential election, even singing Al Green's Let's Stay Together on the stage where giants like Bessie Smith and Billie Holiday had performed. Showtime at the Apollo, a television variety show, became nationally syndicated, bringing the amateur night tradition to audiences who'd never visit Harlem. The show ran for years, introducing new generations to the Apollo's unique performer-audience dynamic. The theatre hosted poetry recitals, boxing matches, political debates, award ceremonies, tribute shows. The Caribbean Music Awards and the Rhythm and Blues Foundation's Pioneer Awards found homes at the Apollo. The programming expanded while maintaining connection to the theatre's core mission, showcasing black talent and serving the Harlem community. In 2018, the ATF announced plans to expand into the Victoria Theatre down the street, adding 2 new performance spaces with 199 and 99 seats. This was the first physical expansion in the Apollo's history, creating smaller venues for emerging artists and experimental work, alongside the main 1,500-seat theatre. The expansion opened in 2022 after pandemic delays, giving the Apollo 3 separate performance spaces and significantly increasing its programming capacity. Now called the Apollo Stages at the Victoria, this expansion allows the theatre to support artists at early career stages, while maintaining the main stage for established performers and major events. By 2024, the Apollo operates as a sophisticated non-profit presenting concerts, theatrical productions, dance performances, film screenings, educational programs, and community outreach. Before COVID, the ATF's education programs reached 20,000 children annually. They've created internship programs in event management, technical production, and theatre administration, training the next generation of entertainment professionals. The Apollo's transformation from struggling commercial venue to thriving cultural institution represents a remarkable resurrection. But it also represents something else. Recognition that some places matter beyond profit margins, that cultural heritage has value that can't be measured in quarterly earnings, that preserving spaces where history happened matters to communities and to the nation. The legacy? Stand outside 253 West 125th Street today, and you'll see that iconic red marquee stretching across the facade. Tourists photograph it constantly. Tour buses stop there. People from around the world make pilgrimages to see the theatre where Ella Fitzgerald found her voice, where James Brown recorded the greatest live album ever made, where amateur night turned brutal crowd judgment into a star-making machine. The mythology has grown so large that former owner Robert Schiffman once claimed you could write Apollo Theatre on a postcard, drop it in a mailbox anywhere in the world, and it would be delivered. No address needed, just Apollo Theatre. That's how famous it became. But beneath the mythology sits a more complex history. The Apollo opened as a whites-only burlesque house in a black neighbourhood. It only became a showcase for black talent when economic necessity made exclusion unsustainable. Frank Schiffman and Leo Brecker saw a business opportunity in serving the Harlem community, and they built something important from that pragmatic foundation. The performers who walked that stage faced pressures and obstacles most modern artists can't imagine. They worked the Chitlin circuit because mainstream venues wouldn't book them. They developed their craft at the Apollo because opportunities elsewhere didn't exist. They endured amateur night's brutal crowd judgment because that's what it took to prove themselves worthy of bigger stages. The Apollo audience earned its reputation for sophisticated, critical judgment because they knew music intimately, lived it daily, understood nuances that casual listeners missed. They demanded excellence because they'd heard excellence and wouldn't settle for less. That standard pushed performers to heights they might not have reached in more forgiving environments. Amateur night's brutality wasn't cruelty for its own sake. It was quality control enforced by audiences who knew greatness when they heard it and refused to pretend otherwise. The crowd's judgment came from lived experience with music that white audiences often didn't have. These were people who'd grown up in churches where gospel choirs performed every Sunday, who'd attended rent parties where jazz musicians played until dawn, who'd listened to R&B on the radio and discussed vocal techniques, instrumental arrangements, rhythmic innovations with the kind of detailed analysis that music critics got paid to write. The Apollo audience wasn't passive consumers. They were active participants in musical culture, educated listeners who could distinguish genuine talent from mere competence. When performers talk about the Apollo crowd with a mixture of respect and terror, they're acknowledging that this audience couldn't be fooled. You couldn't hide behind studio production tricks. You couldn't rely on your record label's marketing budget to manufacture enthusiasm. You had to deliver, live, in real time, in front of people who'd seen the greatest performers in American music history stand on that same stage. The comparison was implicit and inescapable. You were being judged against legends, and the audience wouldn't pretend you measured up if you didn't. The theatre's decline in the 1970s reflected both Harlem's economic collapse and the painful irony that the civil rights movement's success made the Chitlin circuit obsolete. Breaking down barriers meant black performers could play at downtown venues now, could appear on mainstream television, could record for major labels, and reach white audiences without mediation. That was progress, undeniably. Generations of black performers had fought for those opportunities, had endured discrimination and exclusion, had demanded the right to compete on equal terms in the broader entertainment industry. Success meant black performers didn't need the Apollo the way they once had. Better opportunities existed elsewhere. Bigger paydays waited in Las Vegas, in Los Angeles recording studios, in concert venues that could accommodate larger audiences and generate more revenue. Mainstream acceptance that previous generations had been denied was now achievable for talented black performers, which was exactly what the civil rights movement had fought to accomplish. But it also meant venues like the Apollo lost their monopoly on showcasing black talent, which threatened their economic viability. The very success that civil rights activism achieved undermined the business model that had sustained black-focused venues like the Apollo. White audiences discovering black music meant black performers could reach larger markets, but it also meant the Apollo faced competition it had never faced before. The resurrection showed that some institutions matter beyond economics, that cultural value exists independent of profit margins. The non-profit model, the state's $1 lease, the landmark designations, the foundation's educational mission, all of it represented recognition that the Apollo's value transcended ticket sales. Some places are worth preserving, even if they don't make financial sense in conventional business terms. Since 1934, the Apollo has launched or significantly boosted careers of performers who shaped American music. Ella Fitzgerald, Billie Holiday, Sarah Vaughan, Sammy Davis Jr., James Brown, Gladys Knight, Luther Vandross, D'Angelo, Lauryn Hill, Mariah Carey. The list goes on, spanning generations and genres, representing the evolution of American popular music from jazz and swing through bebop, R&B, soul, funk, hip-hop. The Apollo didn't just showcase these artists, it shaped them. That stage demanded excellence. That crowd required authenticity. That building connected performers to audiences who understood exactly what they were hearing and judged accordingly. The pressure forged greatness. Walk into the Apollo today and you'll see memorial plaques dedicated to performers who graced that stage. You'll feel the weight of history in a way few venues can match. You'll understand, perhaps for the first time, that some places become more than just buildings. They become repositories of collective memory, witnesses to moments that changed culture, sacred spaces where ordinary people did extraordinary things. The Apollo's tagline says, "Where stars are born and legends are made." It's not hollow marketing, it's observable historical fact. That stage has hosted more legendary performances, launched more iconic careers, shaped more of American popular music than any other single venue in the nation. But more than that, the Apollo represents resilience. It survived exclusion, economic collapse, neighborhood decline, commercial failure, and repeated predictions of permanent death. It came back every time because people refused to let it die, understanding that losing the Apollo meant losing something irreplaceable in American cultural history. The theatre continues today, not just as a museum or memorial, but as a living, working venue where new artists develop, where amateur night still separates contenders from pretenders, where audiences still demand excellence and get it. That continuity matters. Heritage that's actively practiced means more than heritage that's merely preserved behind glass. The Apollo story is America's story of race, music, commerce, community, and culture, intersecting in ways both beautiful and painful. It's about barriers erected and barriers broken. It's about talent flourishing despite obstacles designed to suppress it. It's about audiences supporting excellence when mainstream culture denied it existed. It's about business pragmatism creating cultural institutions that outlasted their commercial purpose. Most of all, it's about that stage. That 125th Street stage where magic happened and still happens. Where Ella Fitzgerald conquered her fear and found her voice. Where James Brown redefined what live performance could be. Where countless unknowns walked out hoping for their shot and either seized it or learned they weren't ready yet. That stage has witnessed more dreams realized and more dreams crushed than almost any place in American entertainment. It's hosted triumph and humiliation, brilliance and mediocrity, legends in the making, and forgotten wannabes who never made it past one brutal Wednesday night. And it's still there, still judging, still demanding excellence, still launching careers for anyone brave enough and talented enough to face that crowd and win them over. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more fascinating stories. There's a place in Dearborn, Michigan, where you could walk in one end with iron ore and walk out the other with a finished automobile. 1.5 miles wide, 1 mile long, 93 buildings, 100,000 workers at its peak. The Ford River Rouge complex wasn't just a factory. It was an industrial city without residents, a monument to American manufacturing power, a place where raw materials transformed into the machines that put the world on wheels. And for decades, it worked exactly as Henry Ford envisioned, until it didn't. This is the story of how the world's most advanced factory became a symbol of everything Detroit lost. The vision. In 1915, Henry Ford bought 2,000 acres of swampy bottomland along the Rouge River in Dearborn. His friends thought he'd lost his mind. The property was marshland, prone to flooding, miles from anything useful. It sat at the confluence of the Rouge and Detroit rivers, just a few miles south of Detroit proper, but it might as well have been wilderness. There were no buildings worth mentioning, no infrastructure, nothing but mud and water and land that seemed good for absolutely nothing. Ford told people he was thinking about turning it into a bird sanctuary, a nature preserve, somewhere peaceful where birds could nest undisturbed by the noise and smoke of industry. He painted himself as a lover of nature, someone who wanted to preserve this wetland habitat for future generations to enjoy. Some people actually believed him. He was lying through his teeth. Ford had something else in mind entirely, something nobody had ever attempted before on this scale. He wanted total control, complete autonomy, independence from every supplier, every middleman, every person who stood between raw materials and finished automobiles. The Highland Park plant had made Ford rich and famous with the Model T, revolutionizing manufacturing with the moving assembly line and making automobiles affordable for ordinary Americans. But Highland Park relied on thousands of suppliers for parts, materials, components. Every piece came from someone else. Every delay, every quality problem, every price increase came from dependency on outsiders. Ford hated that dependency more than almost anything. He wanted to own everything, control everything, answer to nobody. Why should he pay others to transform his raw materials into steel, rubber, glass when he could do it himself? Why should he worry about the cost of electricity when he could build his own power plant and generate exactly what he needed? Why should he trust suppliers when he could make everything internally? The concept was called vertical integration, though Ford didn't care much about academic terminology. He just knew he wanted to buy iron ore at one end of his facility and drive finished automobiles out the other, with every single step in between happening under his direct control, on his property, by his workers, according to his standards. No excuses, no delays, no surprises. At Highland Park, Ford had perfected the moving assembly line. The Rouge would be his next revolution, complete control of the entire production process from nature's raw materials to consumer's driveway. If it worked, he'd be unstoppable. If it failed, he'd lose everything. The bird sanctuary story was convenient cover while he quietly assembled one of the largest industrial sites in America. By the time people figured out what he was really planning, Ford owned the land, had the vision mapped out in his mind, and was ready to move. Nobody could stop him even if they wanted to. Construction began in April 1917, triggered not by Ford's ambitions, but by war. The United States was entering World War I, and Under-Secretary of the Navy, Franklin D. Roosevelt, personally asked Henry Ford to build Eagle boats, submarine hunters designed to patrol for German U-boats threatening Allied shipping. Ford agreed, seeing opportunity in the government's desperation. The Navy needed boats fast, and Ford promised to deliver. Building B rose in 1918, a massive three-story structure designed specifically for shipbuilding. It was the first substantial building on the Rouge site, and it became the foundation for everything that followed. Ford dredged and widened the Rouge River dramatically to accommodate the boats, fundamentally changing the waterway to serve his industrial vision. The engineering required was substantial. The river had to be wide enough and deep enough for boats to navigate, with proper docking facilities and infrastructure to support construction. The Eagle boats never saw combat. World War I ended in November 1918, before the Ford-built submarine hunters ever deployed. The Navy cancelled most of the order. Some people called it a waste, all that effort for boats that never fired a shot at the enemy. But Ford saw it differently. The Eagle boat project proved something crucial to his larger plans. It showed that the Rouge River could be widened enough to bring in massive lake freighters carrying iron ore, coal, and limestone. Raw materials could be delivered directly to the factory by water, eliminating the need for costly overland transport. Ford's vertical integration dream suddenly became physically possible in ways it never could have been at Highland Park, which lacked water access for heavy cargo. The infrastructure built for wartime shipbuilding laid the groundwork for peacetime industrial dominance. Between 1918 and 1928, Ford built what became the largest integrated factory in the world. The construction process itself was staggering in scope. Architect Albert Kahn, one of the most renowned industrial architects of his era, designed most of the buildings. Kahn specialized in factory design, and he created modernist industrial structures that were revolutionary for their time, combining functionality with architectural innovation. His glass plant, completed in 1925, featured massive glass panels in walls that stretched 760 feet long and 240 feet wide, flooding the workspace with natural light. It was beautiful in its own stark way, and it proved that factory buildings didn't have to be dark, oppressive dungeons. Natural light improved both working conditions and product quality. Workers could see what they were doing. The glass plant replaced Ford's previous facility in Highland Park, centralizing production at the Rouge. His tire plant, finished on January 30th, 1938, measured over 800 feet long and 240 feet wide, with a distinctive butterfly roof and similar large glass panels flooding the interior with light. These buildings weren't just functional boxes. They were architectural statements about what industrial design could be, marrying form and function in ways that influenced factory architecture worldwide for decades. The completed complex, finished in 1928, measured an almost incomprehensible 1.5 miles wide by 1 mile long. 93 buildings covering nearly 16 million square feet of factory floor space. Walking from one end to the other took significant time. You could get lost in there if you didn't know the layout. The numbers alone don't capture what Ford created, but try to imagine it. This wasn't just a big factory. This was industrial self-sufficiency on a scale never before achieved in human history. The Rouge had its own massive docks where Ford-owned lake freighters unloaded iron ore from Ford-owned mines in Minnesota's Mesabi Range and Michigan's Upper Peninsula. Those ships, operated by Ford's own fleet, travelled the Great Lakes carrying hundreds of tons of ore at a time, docking at facilities Ford built specifically to receive them. The whole system was Ford-controlled from mine to dock to factory floor. Inside the complex, 100 miles of internal railroad track connected buildings and moved materials between operations. Ford even bought his own railroad, the Detroit, Toledo and Ironton, in 1920 to speed delivery to and from the Rouge. Later, he created the Ford Rouge Railroad with 110 miles of track, 16 locomotives moving materials constantly. 27 miles of conveyor belts carried parts and materials through the production process, creating a continuous flow that never stopped. 53,000 machine tools performed every operation imaginable. The scale was simply staggering. The facility included blast furnaces where iron ore was smelted into molten iron, heated to over 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Open hearth steel mills where that iron was refined into steel. A rolling mill that shaped steel into sheets, bars and forms. Foundries that cast engine blocks and other heavy components. Metal stamping facilities where those steel sheets became fenders, hoods, doors, roof panels. Engine casting plants. Frame and assembly plants. Transmission plants. Radiator plants. Tool and die shops that created and maintained the precision instruments needed for every operation. But the facilities went beyond just automotive production. The complex included a cement plant that processed limestone into cement used in construction throughout the operation. A glass plant that turned sand into windows and windshields using a continuous process Ford helped develop, producing higher quality glass at lower cost than competitors. A tyre plant where rubber became the wheels that put cars on the road. Byproducts plants that took waste materials from steel production and transformed them into petroleum products, paints, fertilizers, and charcoal. Nothing was wasted. Everything had value. Every material got used somehow. Ford even built a soybean conversion plant in later years, grinding soybeans into materials that could be molded into plastic auto parts. He experimented constantly with new materials and processes, always looking for ways to reduce costs and increase self-sufficiency. The power plant alone was massive, a cathedral of industrial energy generation, producing enough electricity to light a city the size of Detroit itself. Twin Babcock and Wilcox boilers, each capable of carrying 200 pounds of steam pressure, generated the energy that powered the entire complex. These weren't small units tucked in a corner somewhere. They were enormous structures requiring constant attention from skilled operators, burning a mixture of natural gas, pulverized coal, and blast furnace gas. At times, the Rouge generated so much surplus power that Ford sold electricity to Detroit Edison Company, essentially operating as a utility company in addition to being an automaker. Ford ordered duplicate systems for all critical infrastructure because he couldn't tolerate downtime or dependency on outside power sources. If one boiler failed, another immediately took over. If one generator broke, others compensated. The redundancy meant the Rouge almost never stopped for lack of power or mechanical failure. It was engineered to run continuously, perpetually, endlessly churning out automobiles regardless of what broke down or what went wrong. The scope of Ford's resource ownership extended far beyond the Rouge site itself. He owned 700,000 acres of forest land in Michigan's Upper Peninsula. providing lumber for car bodies and wooden components. Those forests included sawmills and lumber operations that processed trees into usable materials, all Ford-owned and Ford-operated. He owned iron mines and limestone quarries covering vast territories in northern Michigan, Minnesota, and Wisconsin. The Mesabi Range in Minnesota held some of America's richest iron ore deposits, and Ford controlled significant portions of those reserves. Mining operations there employed thousands, extracting ore that travelled by rail to Ford's docks on the Great Lakes, then by Ford's ships to the Rouge. He owned coal mines covering thousands of acres in Kentucky, West Virginia, and Pennsylvania. Coal fired the blast furnaces, powered the boilers, fueled the entire operation. Ford wanted to ensure he'd never run short, never face price increases from suppliers who knew he depended on them. Owning the mines meant controlling costs and supply. He even purchased and operated a rubber plantation called Fordlandia in Brazil. The project was ambitious but troubled, plagued by labour problems, agricultural challenges, and local resistance. It never achieved Ford's goal of rubber self-sufficiency, but it demonstrated just how far he'd go to escape dependency on others. If he could grow his own rubber trees in the Amazon and ship raw rubber to Detroit for processing, he would. The fact that the plantation mostly failed didn't diminish his determination to try. To bring all these materials from mines, forests, and plantations to the Rouge, Ford operated his own fleet of massive ore freighters plying the Great Lakes. The SS William Clay Ford and other vessels carried hundreds of tons of raw materials on each voyage, making regular runs from mining regions to Dearborn. Ford also operated an entire regional railroad company, the Detroit, Toledo, and Ironton, purchased specifically to move materials and finished vehicles more efficiently than relying on other rail lines. Ford's ambition for complete self-sufficiency was never totally realized. At no time did he have fewer than 6,000 suppliers serving the Rouge, providing specialized components, materials, or services that Ford couldn't economically produce himself. But no one before or since has come as close to true vertical integration on such a massive industrial scale. The dream was impossible, but Ford got closer than anyone thought possible. One new car rolled off the line every 49 seconds. Every day, workers smelted more than 1,500 tons of iron and manufactured 500 tons of glass. The Rouge truly was a city without residents, a self-contained industrial empire that could turn raw materials into finished automobiles, all within one sprawling complex. The first vehicles assembled at the Rouge weren't cars, but tractors. Ford's Fordson tractor, the world's first mass-produced farm tractor, began production there in 1921. Ford wanted to revolutionize farming the same way he'd revolutionized transportation. In 1927, after the Model T ended production, the Rouge achieved full automotive ore-to-assembly capability with the new Model A. Building B became the heart of assembly operations, a role it would maintain for decades. People came from around the world to see the Rouge. Economic development specialists, industrialists, engineers, artists, filmmakers all made pilgrimages to witness what Ford had built. The plant inspired similar facilities worldwide. Renault's Ile-Séguin factory in 1920, Gaz's factory in the Soviet Union in the 1930s, Volkswagen's Wolfsburg plant in 1938, Fiat's Mirafiori factory in 1939. The Rouge became the template for modern automotive manufacturing. Free tours began in 1924, and at their peak, approximately 1 million visitors per year walked through the complex, marvelling at the scale and efficiency of Ford's industrial cathedral. Charlie Chaplin studied the Rouge for his 1936 film Modern Times, using its assembly lines as inspiration for his satire of industrial labour. In 1932, Mexican muralist Diego Rivera spent a month at the Rouge studying its operations, machines, and workers. The result was his Detroit Industry murals at the Detroit Institute of Arts, monumental frescoes that captured the power and complexity of modern industrial production. This was Detroit at its apex, American manufacturing at its most powerful. One man's vision of industrial self-sufficiency realized on a scale that seemed impossible. And it worked. For decades, it worked brilliantly. But that success contained the seeds of its own destruction. The workers. The Rouge needed bodies. Lots of them. When Ford announced in 1914 that he'd pay $5 a day, workers came from everywhere. That wage was revolutionary, roughly double what other factories paid. Ford didn't raise wages out of generosity. He did it because turnover at his Highland Park plant was crushing. Workers hated the assembly line's repetitive, mind-numbing work and quit constantly. The $5 day was meant to make people stay. It worked. Word spread fast. Italians escaping Mussolini's growing fascist power, Russians fleeing revolution and upheaval, Southern black Americans seeking escape from Jim Crow oppression, Eastern Europeans looking for opportunity. They all heard about the $5 day and came to Detroit. Thousands lined up outside the Rouge, sometimes starting at 2 in the morning in winter, whenever word went out that Ford was hiring. Former UAW leader Doug Fraser recalled thousands of workers forming lines that stretched for blocks, all hoping for a chance at a factory job that paid better than anything they'd ever imagined. But that $5 came with conditions. Ford created the sociological department to investigate workers' private lives. They'd visit homes unannounced, checking if families lived according to Ford's standards of cleanliness, sobriety, and moral behaviour. Immigrants had to attend English classes. Workers couldn't drink alcohol. Ford wanted to reshape not just how people worked, but how they lived. Inside the Rouge, conditions were brutal. The heat from blast furnaces made summer work almost unbearable. The noise was deafening. The air quality was terrible. Injuries were common. The pace was relentless. Workers called it the sweatshop or the butcher house because of how hard the work was, how little regard management showed for worker safety or comfort. Ford's service department, run by Harry Bennett, kept workers in line through intimidation and surveillance. Bennett, a former boxer and personal associate of Henry Ford, controlled a quasi-military force that watched workers constantly, both inside the plant and outside it. Workers were routinely followed home, their activities monitored, their conversations reported. Speaking favourably about unions could get you fired. Or worse. The Rouge's workforce was remarkably diverse for its time. By the 1930s, it employed workers from dozens of countries speaking dozens of languages. Management used this diversity as a tool, playing ethnic groups against each other to prevent unity and organisation. Different nationalities often worked in different departments, making solidarity difficult. But 3 events would forever change the relationship between Ford and its workers, transforming the Rouge from Ford's kingdom into a battlefield for workers' rights. The Hunger March. March 7th, 1932. The Great Depression had devastated Detroit. Ford had laid off thousands of Rouge workers, and those still employed faced reduced hours and wages. Unemployment in Detroit exceeded 30%. People were starving. The city's relief programs were collapsing under demand. About 3,000 unemployed workers, many of them former Rouge employees, marched from Detroit to Dearborn to present Henry Ford with a list of demands. They wanted jobs. They wanted relief for the unemployed. They wanted better working conditions for those still employed. They wanted the right to organise without intimidation. The marchers reached the Ford-owned streets approaching the Rouge complex. Dearborn police, controlled by Ford, ordered them to disperse. The marchers refused. Police responded with tear gas. The crowd pushed forward anyway. Then police and Ford security guards opened fire. It wasn't warning shots. They aimed into the crowd and shot to kill. Dozens were injured. 5 men died: Joe York, Coleman Lenny, Joe Bussell, who was only 16 years old, Joe de Blasio, and Curtis Williams. 60 protesters were arrested, some chained to their hospital beds while they recovered from gunshot wounds. 5 days later, a funeral procession for the dead marchers drove down Woodward Avenue. 30,000 people gathered to express sympathy and outrage. The brutality shocked even a city accustomed to corporate violence against workers. Detroit's Communist Party organised the funeral, and the murdered workers became martyrs for labour rights. Ford tried to spin the massacre as the work of outside agitators, communist troublemakers who'd provoked the violence. But everybody knew the truth. These were local Detroit people, former Ford workers who'd been discarded when profits dropped. The Hunger March radicalised a generation of Detroit workers and set the stage for what came next. Battle of the Overpass, May 26, 1937. The United Auto Workers had successfully organised General Motors and Chrysler through dramatic sit-down strikes. Ford remained the last holdout among Detroit's big 3 automakers. Henry Ford swore he'd never recognise a union at his facilities. He relied on Harry Bennett and the service department to make sure that never happened. Walter Reuther, Richard Frankenstein, Robert Cantor, and J.J. Kennedy arrived at the Miller Road pedestrian overpass at Gate 4 of the Rouge complex. They had a permit from the city of Dearborn to distribute literature. The leaflets demanded a 6-hour workday for $8, compared to the 8-hour day for $6 then in place. They titled the campaign Unionism, Not Fordism. About 90,000 workers were employed at the Rouge in 1937. The union organisers arrived at shift change, timing their campaign for maximum visibility. Women from UAW Local 174's Ladies Auxiliary came with green berets and leaflets to hand out. Clergymen came as neutral observers. Reporters and photographers came to document the event. Detroit News photographer James Scotty Kilpatrick asked the union leaders to pose for a photo. As Reuther, Frankenstein, Cantor, and Kennedy smiled for the camera, about a dozen men from Ford's service department approached them. What happened next lasted only minutes, but became one of the most famous incidents in American labor history. Bennett's thugs grabbed the union organisers and beat them savagely. They pulled Frankenstein's coat over his head and arms, classic street hood style, and beat him until his face was bloodied and his clothes were torn. They picked up Reuther and repeatedly threw him down a flight of stairs. They attacked the women from the Ladies' Auxiliary. They went after reporters and photographers. 16 unionists were injured, including 7 women. Frankenstein's face was cut and swollen, his shirt blood-stained. Reuther suffered a swollen skull and bruises across his body. Ford security tried to destroy all photographic evidence, smashing cameras and seizing film, but Kilpatrick hid some of his film rolls and gave security blank rolls instead. When those photographs were published, they destroyed Ford's public image. Here was proof, visual documentation, that Ford employed hired thugs to violently attack workers attempting to organise legally. Harry Bennett claimed the union had provoked the attack deliberately to create propaganda. Nobody believed him. The photographs showed the truth too clearly. The National Labour Relations Board pursued Ford for violating the Wagner Act, which prohibited employers from interfering with workers' right to organise. The evidence was overwhelming. Ford tried raising wages after the incident, hoping to buy loyalty and prevent unionisation. It was too late. The Battle of the Overpass became a rallying cry for the UAW. In 1941, workers at the Rouge went on strike, and this time Ford couldn't stop it. The company finally signed a contract with the UAW on June 20, 1941, becoming the last of Detroit's Big Three to recognise the union. The agreement transformed the Rouge from a kingdom ruled by Henry Ford and Harry Bennett into a unionized workplace where workers had rights, protections, and a voice. The golden years. For decades after unionization, the Rouge hummed with productive power. World War II turned the facility into an arsenal of democracy. The Rouge produced jeeps, aircraft engines, components, armor plates, tires, tubes. The complex expanded to meet wartime demand, and employment peaked at over 120,000 workers during the war years. After the war, the Rouge returned to civilian production, churning out the cars that put post-war America on wheels. The 1950s and 1960s were peak years. The Thunderbird, Ford's iconic two-seater introduced in 1954, came from the Rouge. The Mustang, perhaps Ford's most legendary car, began production there in the 1960s. These weren't just cars. They were cultural icons, symbols of American prosperity and freedom. By 1960, the Rouge's workforce demographics had shifted dramatically. African American workers now comprised 65% of employees, though only 3.5% were considered skilled labourers. The plant that had once used diversity to prevent unity had become a majority black workplace, though systemic discrimination in training and promotion persisted. The union fought those battles too. In 1949, a caucus formed to protect African American workers' rights, but their demands were dismissed through red-baiting tactics. The leadership accused them of communist sympathies, using Cold War paranoia to avoid addressing racial discrimination. Progress came slowly, fought for every step of the way. Through it all, the Rouge kept producing. Families worked generation after generation at the plant. Fathers brought sons. Uncles brought nephews. The Rouge became more than just a workplace. It was a community, an identity, a way of life for thousands of families who depended on those paychecks and that union contract. Tours resumed after their wartime suspension. Visitors continued coming to marvel at the scale and complexity of the operation. The Rouge remained a tourist attraction, a symbol of American industrial might, proof that Detroit and American manufacturing remained world leaders. But the world was changing in ways that would make the Rouge's integrated vertical model obsolete, the beginning of the end. The 1970s hit Detroit hard. The energy crisis made gas-guzzling American cars suddenly unappealing. Japanese and European manufacturers offered smaller, more fuel-efficient vehicles that Americans increasingly preferred. Quality problems plagued American automakers, while imports developed reputations for reliability. The severe recession of the early 1980s devastated manufacturing nationwide. Detroit suffered worse than most cities. Unemployment soared, plants closed. The Rouge, which had once seemed invincible, started shedding jobs and operations. In 1981, Ford spun off the Rouge's steel-making operations into a separate company. In 1989, that company became Rouge Steel, and Ford gave up ownership of all Rouge River frontage, boat docks, and about 45% of the original 2,000 acres. Henry Ford's dream of complete vertical integration died that day. The Rouge could no longer turn iron ore into steel, into car parts, all under Ford's control. Employment dropped steadily. Buildings sat empty. Operations that had run continuously for decades shut down. The glass plant, Albert Kahn's modernist masterpiece, was demolished. Workshops and warehouses were abandoned. Whole sections of the complex became industrial ghost towns. By 1992, only Mustang production remained at the Dearborn assembly plant. Ford planned to replace the Mustang with the front-wheel drive Ford Probe, which would have ended Mustang production entirely and likely closed the Rouge for good. Public outcry forced Ford to reconsider. Mustang enthusiasts protested loudly, and sales surged as people rallied to save the iconic car. The The fourth-generation Mustang became a success, which saved the Rouge temporarily. But the reprieve was fragile. The plant needed billions in upgrades. Environmental pressures to clean up decades of industrial pollution mounted. The economics of maintaining old brownfield facilities versus building new greenfield plants made the Rouge look increasingly untenable. Yet the Rouge community refused to accept closure quietly. Families who'd worked there for generations, union members who'd fought for decades to build UAW Local 600 into a power, workers who'd given their careers to the plant. They weren't willing to walk away without a fight. The Rouge had become their identity, their heritage, their lives. Tragedy. February 1st, 1999, approximately 1:20 in the afternoon. Brian Papke of Allen Park was working at the Rouge when everything went dark. Then came the explosion. Boiler number 6 in the Rouge powerhouse exploded with devastating force. The blast was so powerful it blew out windows across the site. Debris scattered everywhere. A plume of black smoke rose so high it could be seen for miles. Workers described a scene from hell. 6 men died. Donald Harper, 58, a pipe fitter with 35 years at the Rouge, died instantly in the initial blast. Over the next 3 weeks, 5 more men succumbed to their terrible injuries. Cody Boatwright, 51. Ken Anderson, 44. John Arsenault, 45. Ron Moritz, 46. Warren Blow, 51. 14 others were critically injured, many with severe burns covering large portions of their bodies. Workers who witnessed the aftermath described skin hanging in sheets, yellow and peeling. People burned so badly they were unrecognizable. The injured were rushed to burn units in Detroit, Ann Arbor, and Toledo. The fire department battled flames for hours. At least 45 ambulances stayed at the Rouge for hours. Hospitals across the region went on full disaster alert, clearing emergency rooms and preparing for mass casualties. Ford evacuated the entire complex. Workers and management worried the explosion might spread through underground tunnels connecting the powerhouse to other buildings, potentially triggering a catastrophic chain reaction across the entire industrial complex. Workers who made it to emergency cut-off valves likely saved hundreds or thousands of lives by preventing the disaster from spreading. Investigations revealed the cause: a natural gas leak ignited during maintenance work on the boiler. The boiler was being shut down for its annual inspection, a routine procedure that should have been safe, but safety devices had been defeated or removed. Pressure relief valves and related alarms weren't working. There were no posted written procedures for shutting down the boiler. The procedures varied by shift, with different crews using different methods. Gas inadvertently entered the furnace for 1 to 2 minutes, building up until it exploded. This wasn't a random act of God. This was preventable. Workers had reported leaking valves repeatedly. Replacement valves were sitting on a wooden pallet, waiting to be installed when the explosion occurred. The powerhouse had a history: burns in 1986, an explosion in 1989 that killed 2 subcontract workers and released asbestos, safety complaints in 1996 that led to citations and fines. The blast happened while Ford was conducting a multi-billion-dollar cost-cutting campaign. Maintenance had been deferred. Safety protocols had deteriorated. The 80-year-old powerhouse was scheduled to be replaced with a new facility in 2000, but Ford had kept running the old plant right up until it exploded. OSHA investigated. So did the state of Michigan. So did Ford and the UAW jointly. They interviewed over 160 employees, examined 30,000 photographs, reviewed 75 hours of videotape, and 500,000 pages of documents. The findings confirmed what workers already knew: inadequate procedures, defeated safety systems, lack of proper training, corporate negligence. Ford settled with Michigan OSHA for $7 million, including a record $1.5 million civil penalty. the largest ever levied in Michigan following a workplace death investigation. The money went to burn treatment research, employee safety programs, and monitoring systems. Ford avoided criminal prosecution as part of the settlement. Bronze plaques were installed at the complex honoring the 6 dead workers. A memorial went up in 2004 with their photographs. The charred, destroyed powerhouse sat abandoned for years, a grim monument to what happens when profit takes precedence over safety. When cost-cutting endangers lives, when the pursuit of efficiency ignores the human cost, what remains? The Dearborn Assembly Plant closed on May 10, 2004. A red convertible 2004 Ford Mustang GT rolled off the line as the final vehicle built at the historic facility where assembly had begun in 1918. Demolition of the historic buildings was completed in 2008. Where Building B once stood, where Eagle boats were built, and generations of cars were assembled, there's now a 3,000 space parking lot. But the Rouge didn't die entirely. Ford made a decision to reinvent rather than abandon the complex. In 1999, architect William McDonough entered into an agreement to redesign the 85-year-old 1,212-acre facility. The plan was revolutionary: transform the Rouge into a sustainable, environmentally friendly manufacturing complex for the 21st century. The centerpiece was a green roof on the Dearborn truck plant. More than 10 acres of sedum, a low-growing ground cover, was planted on 1.1 million square feet of roof space. The sedum retains and cleanses rainwater, moderates building temperature, and saves energy. It's part of an $18 million rainwater treatment system that cleans 20 billion gallons of water annually, saving Ford from building a $50 million mechanical treatment facility. In September 2020, Ford announced construction of the Ford Rouge Electric Vehicle Center, a $700 million facility to produce the F-150 Lightning electric truck. President Joe Biden toured the plant in May 2021, driving an F-150 Lightning and endorsing electric vehicles in a speech at the facility. Today, the Rouge Center employs about 6,000 workers across 6 Ford factories on 600 acres of land. That's down from 100,000 workers on 2,000 acres at the peak, but it's survival. The complex still builds trucks, still employs thousands, still represents Ford's largest single industrial site. Tours resumed in 2004 in cooperation with the Henry Ford Museum, featuring multimedia presentations and views of the modern assembly floor. In 2017, about 148,000 visitors toured the facility, far fewer than the million per year at the peak, but still substantial interest in seeing what remains of Ford's industrial cathedral. The abandoned powerhouse, that charred monument to the 1999 tragedy, stood for over 2 decades before demolition finally began. Urban explorers photographed the ruins, documenting the decay. YouTube channels like The Proper People produced videos touring the abandoned structure, showing massive smokestacks, empty turbine halls, and the scars of the explosion that killed 6 men. Severstal North America, a Russian steelmaker, now runs steel operations on portions of the former Rouge site. The vertical integration is gone. The self-sufficiency is gone. The dream of one man controlling everything from iron ore to finished automobile is gone. But something survived. The Rouge still makes vehicles, still employs thousands, still anchors Dearborn's economy. UAW Local 600 still represents workers. The Union logo shares space with Ford's on the rebuilt Miller Road overpass where the Battle of the Overpass occurred, a permanent reminder of the violence and the victory. The legacy. The Rouge was never abandoned in the traditional sense, never left to rot like so many Detroit industrial sites. Packard's sprawling factory sits empty and crumbling. The Michigan Central Station stood vacant for decades before recent renovation. Countless smaller factories throughout Detroit were simply walked away from, left to decay and collapse. Ford invested billions to transform the Rouge rather than let it die. But what exists today isn't what Henry Ford built. It's a fragment, a shadow, a reminder of something much larger that once dominated this landscape. The Rouge represented a specific moment in industrial history when vertical integration made sense economically and practically. When one company could own mines and forests and rubber plantations and railroads and ships, and transform all those resources into finished products more efficiently than anyone else. When controlling every step of production from raw material to consumer meant lower costs, better quality, faster production. That moment passed decisively in the late 20th century. Globalization, just-in-time inventory management, specialized suppliers who could produce components better and cheaper than any integrated manufacturer, outsourcing to low-wage regions, all the trends that defined late 20th century manufacturing made the Rouge's model obsolete. Why own iron mines when you can buy steel cheaper from specialized mills? Why operate rubber plantations when global suppliers offer better prices? Why maintain your own railroad when contract shipping costs less? The economics that made vertical integration attractive in the 1920s and 30s had completely reversed by the 1980s and 90s. The human cost of that transition was enormous and rarely fully acknowledged. Tens of thousands of workers lost jobs as the Rouge shed operations and employment. Families who'd worked at the Rouge for generations, where grandfather brought father, who brought son into the plant, saw that heritage end abruptly. Communities that had grown up around the Rouge, dependent on those paychecks and that economic foundation, watched as employment collapsed and the economic base crumbled. When a factory employing 100,000 workers shrinks to 6,000, the ripple effects spread far beyond the factory walls. Stores lose customers, restaurants close, housing values collapse, tax revenues plummet, schools face budget crises. The entire economic ecosystem that had sustained itself on Rouge wages finds itself suddenly struggling to survive. The consequences cascaded through Dearborn and the broader Detroit region for decades. But the Rouge also represented something else that transcends its industrial function: the power of organized labor to fight for dignity and rights against corporate power. The Hunger March, the Battle of the Overpass, decades of union organizing and collective action, all of that happened because workers refused to accept being treated as disposable machinery, as interchangeable parts that could be used up and discarded. They demanded to be treated as human beings deserving of safety, fair wages, and respect. Those battles were never fully won, never permanently resolved. The 6 men who died in the 1999 power plant explosion died because the lessons of the 1930s labour struggles had been forgotten or ignored. Because cost-cutting and profit maximising had overwhelmed safety considerations. Because the same forces that led to the Hunger March massacre and the Battle of the Overpass beatings had never truly gone away, just evolved into new forms that were sometimes harder to see and fight. The explosion happened during a massive cost-cutting campaign. Maintenance was deferred to save money. Safety protocols deteriorated to speed operations. Training was reduced to cut expenses. The 80-year-old powerhouse that should have been replaced the years earlier kept running because replacing it cost money and shutting it down meant lost production. When it finally exploded, 6 men paid with their lives for those financial decisions made in boardrooms far from the boiler room floor. The Rouge inspired factories worldwide, becoming the template that industrial planners everywhere studied and emulated. The Soviet Union sent engineers to learn from it, implementing similar systems in their massive automotive plants. Volkswagen copied Ford's methods when building Wolfsburg. Renault studied the Rouge for their Ile-Séguin factory. Fiat built Mirafiori based on Rouge principles. The influence on global manufacturing was profound and lasting, even as the Rouge itself declined and transformed. Today, when politicians and business leaders talk about bringing manufacturing back to America, about rebuilding industrial capacity, about making things again instead of just moving money around through financial engineering, they're often talking about recreating what the Rouge represented at its peak. Self-sufficiency instead of dependency on foreign suppliers. Jobs for tens of thousands instead of stock buybacks for shareholders. Products stamped "Made in America" that were genuinely made here from start to finish, with American labour and American materials and American expertise. But they're also romanticising a past that had brutal realities they conveniently forget to mention. The Rouge was built on hard, dangerous, often degrading labour performed by workers who had few rights and fewer protections. It worked people until they broke physically and mentally, then discarded them when they could no longer maintain the brutal pace. It fought unions with violence, using hired thugs to beat organisers bloody while police looked the other way. It polluted the air and water for decades, poisoning the environment and communities surrounding it without regard for long-term consequences. The Golden Age wasn't golden for everyone who lived through it. The prosperity was real for many, but it came at costs that are often erased from nostalgic memories. The wages Ford paid were revolutionary, yes, but they came with invasive surveillance of workers' private lives. The jobs were plentiful, yes, but they were physically exhausting and mentally numbing. The production was impressive, yes, but it generated environmental damage that took generations to begin addressing. The Hunger March massacre happened during this supposed golden age. The Battle of the Overpass happened when the Rouge was at peak employment and production. Workers died from industrial accidents regularly throughout the Rouge's history, though most didn't make headlines like the 1999 explosion. The past we sometimes long to return to wasn't simple or uncomplicated. It was messy, violent, unjust in many ways, even as it was productive and profitable and seemingly powerful. The transformed Rouge, with its green roof designed by sustainability architect William McDonough and its sophisticated rainwater management systems, represents a different vision of industrial production. Manufacturing that doesn't destroy the environment it operates in. Production that operates within emissions limits and environmental regulations. Workplaces where employees have unions, protections, safety standards enforced by law rather than ignored for convenience. It's smaller than the Peak Rouge, employs far fewer people than the glory days, produces fewer vehicles than the 1930s operation. But it exists in a world where those who work there have rights their predecessors fought and sometimes died to secure. They have union representation through UAW Local 600. They have safety regulations enforced by federal and state agencies. They have pollution limits that protect surrounding communities. They work in a facility that at least attempts to operate sustainably, rather than simply consuming resources and generating waste without concern. That's something. That's progress, even if it's accompanied by fewer jobs and reduced economic impact. The question Detroit and America faces isn't whether to return to the Rouge's golden age. That's impossible, even if it were desirable. The question is whether American manufacturing can find a sustainable path forward that provides good jobs while operating responsibly within environmental and social limits. Whether industry can exist without destroying communities and exploiting workers. Whether we can make things at scales that matter while treating both people and planet with something resembling respect. The Rouge stands as both warning and hope in that conversation. Warning of what happens when we forget the human cost of production, when we prioritise efficiency and profit above safety and dignity. Warning that even the mightiest industrial complexes can become obsolete when economic conditions shift. warning that communities built around single massive employers are vulnerable when those employers change or shrink or disappear, but also hope that transformation is possible, that adaptation can succeed, that even the most seemingly obsolete industrial sites can find new relevance if enough people refuse to let them die completely. Hope that organised labour can fight for and win dignity and protections that corporations wouldn't voluntarily provide. Hope that we can learn from past mistakes and build better, more sustainable, more humane industrial operations going forward. The Rouge's story is America's industrial story in microcosm. The ambition and innovation that built it, creating something unprecedented in scale and efficiency. The exploitation and violence that marked its early years, treating workers as expendable components. The union battles that brought some measure of dignity and protection to working people. The peak of prosperity and productive power when American manufacturing seemed unstoppable. The decline as the world changed and the model that worked so brilliantly became increasingly unworkable. The struggle to find new purpose and relevance in a transformed economy. The complex legacy that remains, neither purely good nor purely bad, but profoundly important to understanding where we've been and where we might go. When Detroit ruled the world, when American manufacturing dominated globally, the Rouge was the throne room where that power was most visibly concentrated. That era ended definitively, victim to forces both internal and external, but something survived the transition. Transformed and reduced, but still operating, still employing thousands, still producing vehicles that carry the Ford name. And in an age when American manufacturing seems like a fading memory, when industrial decay symbolizes economic decline, when Rust Belt cities struggle to find new identities, the Rouge stands as both reminder and possibility. Reminder of what was lost when we deindustrialized without planning for consequences. Possibility that even industrial ruins can be reimagined and reborn if we commit the resources and imagination to transforming them. Both warning about the costs of treating workers and environment as expendable, and hope that we can build better, fairer, more sustainable industry if we choose to. The Rouge's legacy isn't simple or comfortable. It's complicated, messy, full of contradictions and tensions, just like the American industrial experience it helped define. Understanding that complexity matters more than celebrating or condemning it simplistically. Because the questions it raises about power, labour, environment, technology, economy, they're still with us. Still demanding answers we haven't fully figured out. Still shaping our world in ways both obvious and subtle. That's why the Rouge story matters. Not just as history, though the history is important, but as ongoing conversation about what we value, what we're willing to sacrifice, what kind of society and economy we want to build. Those aren't settled questions. The Rouge reminds us they never were. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more fascinating stories.